From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We return from the long holiday weekend here in the United States, focused once again on the possibility of recession, with Larry Summers of Harvard telling us just on Friday that we may already be in one.
People often say it's a recession when you have 2 quarters of negative GDP growth in a row. And there's, I think, probably close to a 50-50 chance, maybe it's a bit less than that, that we've had 2 negative quarters in a row.
To get her take on what's going on with this U.S. economy right now, we turn now to Greene. She's Kroll Institute chief economist and senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Great to have you, Megan. Congratulations, by the way, on your new position. So you know Larry Summers well. As I understand it, you economists don't have a very precise definition of a recession, but what is the likelihood we are in a recession, and does it matter?
Yeah, so if you do measure it as 2 quarters of consecutive contraction, then it's possible we're in a recession. We contracted in the first quarter, of course, and the Atlanta GDP now suggests that the U.S. economy has contracted in the second quarter as well. I prefer the NBER's definition of a recession, which is basically to just not have one. They have a methodology looking at a bunch of different factors, which they weight differently every time, so it's constantly changing. It makes it a little bit less helpful in calling a recession, but I do think that's probably the right way to look at it. A recession matters because, of course, it creates pain for all kinds of people and companies in the economy. It has market implications, but not all recessions are created equal either. So I think, what kind of recession we might be in is just as important. And there, I'll say we have 11.5 million unfilled jobs in the U.S. The labor market continues to heal. If we are in recession, it's a pretty weird one, given that the labor market is so strong.
Well, that's just what I was going to ask you. When you talk about the pain that comes with a recession, and we're not necessarily experiencing in the job market yet, have we had a recession, which is basically instead of a jobless recovery, a job-full recession?
Yeah, it could be the inversion of a jobless recovery, which we've seen before. We saw, after the global financial crisis, of course. It's possible that we're in a contraction with an incredibly strong labor market. Look, we've never shut down the economy, put it on a deep freeze in a pandemic, and then defrosted it all of a sudden before. So strange things are certainly happening, whether it's in supply or demand, or whether it's in actually having a contraction while the labor market continues to heal. It is weird. I mean, the best indicator of a recession, way better than any economist and way better than a yield curve inversion, is actually ticking up unemployment. The SOM indicator, which is a measure of ticking up unemployment, that's the best indicator that we're going into recession. We're way off of actually triggering that SOM indicator. As I mentioned, the labor market continues to heal. And then also, it's worth pointing out, there's a ton of cash in our economy. So we pushed out $2.5 trillion to U.S. households in total. They've burned through some of those cash savings, and so they're at about 2.1 trillion excess savings in the economy. That's a lot, on top of which companies have built up their cash positions massively over the course of the pandemic. So there's a huge cash buffer, I think, that we need to burn through before we really get to retrenchment. So whether we're in a technical recession or not, I'm not sure it matters that much. I think we're a ways off from really going into a painful contraction.
What do you expect on Friday? We get jobs numbers on Friday. Everybody's been looking at them very closely.
Yeah, I think the hope is that we get 200 to 300,000 new jobs created, which is a pretty big slowdown in what we've become accustomed to. But if you go back a couple of years, David, that's a huge number still. So I expect the labor market to continue to heal. I also think we'll continue to see people jumping in off the sidelines, jumping back into the labor market as the pandemic becomes more endemic, and as the lower quartile by income runs out of that cash buffer and has to capitulate and get a job. So I think the labor market's going to continue to look better over the next couple of months. And we're going to, like I said, there are 11.5 million unfilled jobs. We're going to need to see a real deterioration in the labor market to really worry about a significant contraction in the U.S. economy.
At the same time, we have that robust job market. We also have robust inflation, if that's the right word for it. A lot of efforts being made, particularly by the administration right now, in addition to the Fed, to try to get that under control. There now is talk going on, including between Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and her counterpart over in China, about possibly relieving some, at least, if not all, of the so-called Trump tariffs on goods. What difference would that make as a practical matter, Megan, to the price of things?
So in terms of the actual impact on inflation, I don't think the impact, unfortunately, will be significant. If you look at what fiscal authorities might do about inflation, there are no silver bullets here. There are a bunch of slow burner issues like improve worker power, boost unionization, improve education. That's not going to kick in for ages. So in terms of what can be done about this inflation now, you could repeal the tariffs. There are some estimates that suggest that could bring CPI inflation down by 1 percentage point. It's over 8%. The Fed's target on average is 2%. So that's a drop in the water. It could help a bit. You could also repeal more tariffs beyond what we've imposed on China. That could help a little bit more. Unfortunately, while central banks can't do anything about supply side shocks, and we've certainly faced a number of successive supply side shocks, I still think that it's really up to the central bank to address the inflation issue. The fiscal authorities are pretty limited in terms of what they can actually do about this beyond long-term slow burner issues. And so it really is up to the Fed. And then what the Fed has, the tool it has to work with is to engage in what they called aggregate demand management, which effectively means killing off demand until it comes in line with supply back into equilibrium. So that's what we're looking at. That's why everybody's so worried about a recession right now. The Fed would be the trigger, certainly.
So what about reducing, if not killing off, some profits? Because we have this debate going on right now. President Biden saying companies are just charging too much, particularly in the energy area, particularly the oil companies. You saw over the weekend, Jeff Bezos really going after the president, saying, you don't understand economics, and the White House pushing back. Has it ever happened, Megan, that in fact, by curtailing profits, you've been able to get prices down?
Yeah, so I mean, what we saw when we actually imposed tariffs was that companies just went with forbearance and let that eat into their profit margins. More recently, since the pandemic hit, we've seen that companies have managed to increase their markups, given the inflation that we're seeing. But it doesn't necessarily follow that if we go ahead and remove tariffs, for example, then margins will necessarily increase. So, I don't think that you can argue this is all down to greedy companies. That might be a small piece of the story, but only a small piece.
Megan, finally, let's turn back to Europe, because you do a lot of work in Europe and writing for the Financial Times, for example, from Europe. And they're in a somewhat of a different situation right now. We see now the euro going really close to parity, 102 last time I checked it, in part because the ECB is taking quite a different path from the Fed. What about the European quandary with respect to its economy?
So inflation in Europe is almost entirely driven by supply side factors, whereas in the US, about half of it is driven by demand, about half by supply. And I mentioned before that central banks can't do anything about the supply side. So the Fed arguably is right in being more hawkish because it can address the demand side drivers of inflation. Whereas in Europe, there aren't that many demand side drivers of inflation. The ECB is getting more hawkish because they're worried about a wage price spiral. There is virtually no evidence suggesting that that's already materializing. But the argument is if you wait for that evidence to materialize, then you're already too late. So the ECB is trying to tighten. They've also got this fragmentation issue in Europe with peripheral countries, particularly Italy, coming under pressure from investors who don't really want to buy up Italian bonds. And given that the ECB has just ended its QE program, there's no real tool in place to reduce spreads. And so I think the ECB, unfortunately, has really messed this one up. Now they're going to have to come up with a brand new tool to try to reduce spreads in the Eurozone. And honestly, that's a needle I don't think the ECB is going to be able to thread. So I expect investors to test this new tool and for there to be a lot of volatility going forward.
That was just my question. What are their chances of succeeding in this? Because, of course, they have 27 different states as opposed to our 50 states that are part of one country here. And as soon as they talked about coming off of some of their quantitative easing, you saw the spreads on the peripherals really blow out, really got them very, very nervous over there. But on the other hand, if they try to address that problem, there are political issues with it.
Yeah, so they're really constrained. They actually already have a tool, the OMT, which is unlimited in size but comes with strict conditionality. They also can reinvest the proceeds from one of their bond buying programs, the PEP, which is limited in size but doesn't have conditions on it. So what they're going to have to come up with is something in between, something that's really big, not unlimited, but big, with some kind of conditionality that's not as strict as what they already have. And it's not clear what the trigger, the conditionality could really be. You know, markets move fast, so it can't be anything tied to a political process. And so many things for betting in the Eurozone are tied to a political process. And it's got to be really big or else it will be illegal. It will be considered monetary financing. So I'm not convinced that the ECB is going to be able to do this. I think the best case is that they do a lot of hand waving to sufficiently confuse investors so that there really is a two-way bet. That's the best we can hope for.
A little bit of magic. Thank you so much, Megan. Always great to have you with us. This is Megan Greene of the Kroll Institute. Coming up, we talk with former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried, about the latest in the war in Ukraine and the pressures on Europe. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date on things from all around the world. For that, we turn to Ritika Gupta here now with the first word. Ritika?
Thanks, David. The mayor of Highland Park, Illinois, says the gun used in the deadly attack on a 4th of July parade was legally obtained. Nancy Rottering suggested to NBC News that the country needs to, quote, re-examine the laws. A 22-year-old man has been arrested in the connection with the shooting. 6 people were killed, dozens more were wounded. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was told of a complaint against Conservative MP Chris Pincher more than 2 years before promoting him. The admission from a Cabinet Office minister today follows days of speculation about what Johnson knew and when. Pincher resigned last week as one of Johnson's political enforcers. Pincher has denied allegations of specific incidents, but said he'd, quote, embarrassed himself and caused upset to others. And Italy has declared a state of emergency in 5 regions devastated by a recent drought as a severe heat wave takes its toll on agriculture and threatens power supplies. High temperatures and exceptionally dry conditions have brought water levels in the Po, the country's largest river, to its lowest level in 70 years. The conditions have led to an estimated 30% decline in seasonal harvests. Prime Minister Mario Draghi links the extreme conditions directly to climate change. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. NATO moved forward today on plans to admit Sweden and Finland, with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg praising the move.
This is an historic day for Finland, for Sweden, for NATO, and for Euro-Atlantic security. Today, we have shown once again that NATO's door is open.
To tell us about this historic day, we welcome now Daniel Fried. He's former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, also Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. Ambassador Fried is now a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. So welcome back, Mr. Ambassador. Great to have you here. An historic day.
Thanks for having me.
Turkey has gone along, but we heard again today they may not in the end ratify it because they want some extradition. How big a threat to that is the admission to the mission of Sweden and Finland?
So far, diplomacy has worked. The Turks initially objected to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. They lifted the objection. But of course, ratification will still be an issue, and I expect there'll be another round of diplomacy. In the end, I think we'll get there, and you're right, it is historic. Finland and Sweden never considered membership in NATO, not in a major way, for many years. And now they have, because Vladimir Putin has started another big war in Europe.
At the same time, it's clear that Vladimir Putin never wanted a stronger NATO. In fact, he would claim that's part of the reason he went into Ukraine originally. Is this dissuading him at all? Or do we have any indication that his behavior is changing because of developments such as this accession of both Sweden and Finland?
He's not going to give up his effort to conquer and subjugate Ukraine unless the Ukrainians, with our help, stop him. This isn't about NATO. Putin has made it clear this is about a war of imperial conquest. Don't take my word for it. He said so. And the only way to stop him is on the battlefield. and by hurting his economy. And that's pretty much the policy of NATO and the G7 and the United States. So it's a tough business, and success is not guaranteed, but is possible. We have to mean it. We have to mean it when we say we're going to push back against Putin's war against Ukraine and threats to Europe.
There's a fair amount that the United States, as well as NATO allies and others, have done to try to push back, to use your phrase. Is there more that can or should be done at this point? What more do the Ukrainians need that we could provide them?
We're sending the right kinds of weapons, finally. I think that it'd be nice if the pace could be accelerated somewhat, and we have to keep this up. This is a war partly of logistics. Will the West be able to arm the Ukrainians so they can fight faster than the Russians can rearm themselves to continue their war? So the battlefield hangs in the balance and will decide much. A second thing the West, the democracies can do is squeeze Russia's economy. The G7 summit last week decided on a number of measures to continue putting pressure on Russia's economy. And if ways forward can be found, which isn't clear yet, because some of these are very tough issues, Putin's economy is going to hurt. And we know from the Cold War that the Soviet economy decayed, partly under pressure of the West, and that was the end of the Soviet Union.
Mr. Ambassador, you, of course, are a career diplomat. You know that terribly well. There's been the ongoing question about negotiations with the Russians for a ceasefire and then ultimately perhaps a peace agreement. What do you think about the back and forth on that? I think the United States position has been consistently, we don't want to do that unless Mr. Zelensky wants it. The Ukrainians have to drive that bus.
Well, let's go back a couple of months. The Ukrainians in the opening part of the war were serious about negotiations. They even floated in public a couple of concessions to the Russians. The Russians were not serious about negotiations. In fact, just last week, the Russians said publicly that the only terms to end the war are basically Ukrainian surrender. And the Ukrainians are not willing to give up territory to the Russians because they know what that means. It means eradication of Ukrainian national identity, arrest and possibly killing of Ukrainian patriots. This isn't hypothetical. We've seen how the Russians behave in the territories they conquer. The Ukrainians want to fight. The Biden administration, rightfully, in my view, has said that negotiations are up to the Ukrainians. We're not going to push them into negotiations. The Ukrainians have to make that decision. That's the right policy. And right now, I think the challenge for the West is to help the Ukrainians militarily by providing weapons, not to fight for them, but help them fight for themselves, and to push the Russian economy so that Putin, with all his cries of victory, really doesn't have to have a victory, but will have to settle for much less than he wants. And what he wants is to conquer Ukraine.
And finally, Mr. Ambassador, in order to push the Russian economy the way you described, we have to keep together the group of countries that have imposed sanctions. So thus far, it looks like on the surface, that's held together, to my way of thinking, remarkably well. What happens if Russia really does cut off the natural gas? Because as we know, that will really do damage to the European economy, particularly, for example, Germany.
The Russians have been cutting off natural gas. They've done it entirely to a bunch of countries. They've been doing it partially to Germany. So this isn't hypothetical. This is really happening. And yeah, the Germans made a big mistake becoming too reliant on Russian natural gas, unlike the Poles, who managed to take themselves off of Russian natural gas and are in a much better position because of it. But we, the West, are not without tools and leverage of our own. For instance, the G7 is now thinking about imposing a price cap on purchases of Russian oil, not just banning it, which the US has already done and Europe is partly doing, but imposing a price cap on worldwide purchases of Russian oil. Now, it's not clear whether this can be done practically, but if so, it would be a big blow to Russia's income. So it's not just Putin who has the initiative. the G7, the United States, the free world has some possibilities if we can think our way through the problem. And it's not easy. These are tough choices. But I wouldn't count out the democracies.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, really good to have you with us. That's Ambassador Daniel Fried of the Atlantic Council. Coming up, stocks are sinking as the euro slides against the dollar. We'll get a check on the markets next with Bloomberg's CRUDE Gupta. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Check in now on the markets, and they are risk off. At least that's the way I'd interpret them. CRUDE Gupta, what do you say?
Yeah, completely risk off. In fact, if you look at the NASDAQ, you are seeing green on the screen, but to me, that is purely a defensive trade. I mean, look, we had the S&P 500 down almost 2% at one point. If you actually look at what's driving it, I wouldn't call it the stock market dynamics in particular. I would say it's all cross-asset. A lot of it's coming from the dollar, actually. The strength in the dollar coming off weakness in the euro. It's kind of this very long markets game of dominoes. Essentially, everything's having this ripple effect. And the euro dollar weakness, I think, is at the crux of it, because that's really what's pushing the greenback even higher. This coming after traders are saying, well, the ECB, we're expecting them to actually slow down, not hike as aggressively because of those recession fears, because of the oil story, some expectations that Russian oil supply and Russian gas supply to Europe will get shut off as close or as soon, I should say, to next week. And that's kind of the fear driving this market.
Well, CRUDE, you say it's the euro-dollar cross, which makes a perfect sense to me, but I wonder if that's more the symptom than the cause. The cause may well be the recession fears, which would drive the oil price down. We went under $100 a barrel here today, right?
Right.
It drives the oil price down. It drives people into the U.S. dollar as a safe haven. It drives a lot of the markets.
Yeah, I almost feel like we're playing doctor here. We're trying to diagnose
exactly.
what's going on. But at the core of it, it does come down to those oil prices. In fact, you actually saw WTI drop below the 100 handle. And when you're looking at NYMEX crude, this is a massive deal because, as Michael Tran over at RBC said, yes, you have these inflationary pressures. Yes, you have less supply. Yes, there seems to be this physical shortage of oil, but you're also staring these inflation pressures down with recession fears as well. If you start to lose that demand that has been surging and has been pushing prices higher, all that support in the market, it's going to essentially collapse to the point where you're seeing moves as violent as 9% of a drop on Brent. To put that in some context, we didn't even see that kind of move during the trade war when we saw the U.S.-China move. So this kind of comes into the same territory as what you saw, arguably, and I say this with a big grain of salt, during what you saw in COVID.
A lot of volatility still. Thank you so much, CRUDE Gupta, for explaining fairly complicated markets. You can catch CRUDE again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, volatility in the energy markets is a big risk to the global economy, as we just talked about. We talked with Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Now to bring you news from all around the world, we turn to Ritika Gupta here with First Word.
Thanks, David. Turkey has renewed its threat to keep Sweden and Finland out of NATO. The Turkish foreign minister says Turkey will not ratify membership in the alliance for the two countries if they don't fulfill their promises to extradite terror suspects. The Turkish parliament will eventually vote on Sweden and Finland's NATO applications. President Biden's special envoy to Iran is blasting the country following the collapse of its latest talks over its tattered nuclear deal. More than a little bit of a wasted occasion is how Special Envoy Robert Malley is describing the recent indirect negotiations in Doha. Speaking with National Public Radio, Malley says Iran rejected, quote, very detailed outlines of an arrangement with the U.S., was willing to accept to revive the 2015 accord. And the 21st century space race is adding to the war of words between the U.S. and China. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesman is accusing NASA administrator Bill Nelson of lying and smearing his country. That's after a German tabloid quoted Nelson as saying the world should be concerned about China laying claim to the moon and stopping other countries from exploring it. China says it's the U.S. that's defined space as a war-fighting domain. And Hong Kong's new leader, John Lee, received more than $1.4 million in cash when he ran unchallenged for the city's top job back in May while under U.S. sanctions. That is according to a government filing now being made public. It illustrates how the former police officer was able to run an election campaign without access to a bank account. His campaign expenditure included over 400 advertisements on U.S.-owned social networks, despite being under sanctions since 2020. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. As we just talked about with Kritika Gupta, the price of oil is driving a lot of the markets today. With the WTI, as I look at the Bloomberg right now, just under $100. Brent is just above $100, but there's been a lot of volatility, and it is affecting a lot of the markets. To give us a read on what's going on with the oil markets, what we can expect, we turn on to Bob McNally. He's co-founder and president of the Rapidan Energy Group that's providing research and analysis for the energy sector. Mr. McNally is the author of CRUDE, Volatility, the history and future of boom-bust oil prices. So, Bob, thanks so much for being with us. If there's anybody we need you to tell us about this volatility. Explain what's going on in the markets right now.
Great to be with you, David. You know, we're getting a taste today of the only way oil price booms end, and it's always a sad ending. It's always with recession and demand declines. The oil market on the supply side is very inelastic, as President Biden and many have learned since last fall. You just can't crank on new oil supply or new refining capacity overnight. So when you get in these situations where you have strong demand exceeding a tapped out supply system, throw in the largest disruption risk since the 70s, it's only going to end one way, and we're getting a taste of that with prices collapsing as we hit demand destruction. Now, it's not clear we're there yet. It's not clear, so the demand is holding up pretty well. We have big disruption risks, so can't rule out a rally even into the third quarter, but this is a foretaste of how this boom is going to end. I think that's what we're seeing today.
So apart from a crash or a recession, a global recession that takes down the demand side, on the supply side, how much can be done as a practical matter to ramp up production? And by the way, it's not just production, but refining as well in the United States, or to get other producers online, such as Saudi Arabia?
Not much. You know, the only spare capacity, the only quickly producible oil that exists at any time in the oil market is what OPEC or OPEC Plus is holding in spare. Currently, we estimate that to be about 1.7 million barrels a day, most of it in Saudi Arabia. But in a 100 million barrel a day market, that's not a lot, especially when you consider the disruption risks. Just last week, we lost half of Libya's supply, and the other half is at high odds of going off in the coming weeks. So unfortunately, the only option, the only good option is spare capacity is too low for the problem to solve this type of problem. That leaves refining capacity. It's tapped out. We're at the high utilization rates in the United States. The Chinese aren't letting all their refineries come back as fast as they could. They're starting to ramp up, but everybody else is operating at full capacity. You just don't add new refining capacity overnight. So unfortunately, the supply side of the system, upstream and downstream, is pretty tapped out.
Even if it's not overnight, Bob, is the willingness there, is the capital there to make long-term investments right now? Because this would be, at least to my mind, a really complicated situation apart from the energy transition that is going on over a longer period of time because of climate. Is there the willingness there and the capital to make long-term investments given the uncertainty about the future with energy?
The capital is there. The willingness to use it is not. You have to remember, we're coming off of a 7-year bust phase, epically prolonged and deepened by COVID. You have investors telling the oil companies, don't you dare add more rigs, add more production, return the cash to shareholders. And then you have politicians in Europe and the United States saying, while we would really like a little more oil right now, we still want to shut you down later this decade. So don't invest in more long-term capacity. Don't build in larger infrastructure and the emissions associated with it. So all the signals coming to the oil industry from the markets, from the 7-year period we just emerged from, and from the political leadership so far, I think this is going to change, but so far has said, don't invest in long-term oil production capacity, especially refining, which is seen sort of as the horse and buggy, if you will, of sort of the 1908. Who wants to invest in that?
Bob, we talked to regulators and lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats on this program every week pretty much. And pretty much all the Republicans say it is actually President Biden's fault, the administration's fault, because they really could do things from a regulatory point of view that would fix this problem, whether it's new leases, whether it's pipeline permits, a vast array of things they could do. Are they right?
There aren't good options for any president to bring down oil prices near term. No president could do that. The best you can do is ask OPEC Plus, and they don't have much to give, okay? What you have to do, though, is avoid mistakes. And I'll give President Biden credit. So far, he has avoided calls to do things like banning product exports or crude exports or imposing price control. So arguably, the only thing any president can do in this situation is not make big mistakes, put in place counterproductive policies. But no, there's no magic wand for any president in this situation.
So that's the United States and President Biden. Tell us about Europe, because Europe has their own energy challenges, particularly when it comes to natural gas. And they've already lost some out of Russia. They may lose a lot more before they're done. Give us a sense of the picture in Europe right now.
Europe is in, unfortunately, an extremely precarious position. It, over the past several decades, has basically wired its energy system to be dependent on Russia, both for oil. Half of Russia's oil exports went to Europe, and especially natural gas through pipelines. And it's a lot harder to replace natural gas than it is oil. So now, Mr. Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, the Europeans, rightly and admirably, are looking to put as much pain on him and are willing to assume the cost, the economic costs of severing, albeit in a phased fashion, first their oil and then perhaps their gas linkages. So it is extremely difficult. And Mr. Putin, if he doesn't allow Nord Stream 1 to restart after July, he can drain Europe's gas stocks before winter. So Europe's next winter may be more difficult than the last one. And so it's a very difficult situation. The US, other countries are trying to help all they can, but in a tapped out supply system, especially for natural gas, it is hard to do a lot in the near term. So Europe is facing huge costs in this, what is now becoming an energy war.
And how much can other countries, the United States, Qatar, for example, which has a lot of natural, how much can they do to alleviate some of that pain? And by the way, do you think the European people are prepared for what might happen next winter?
So not a lot you can do. We need to get the Freeport facility up and running as fast as possible. That is absolutely critical. I think 4 cargoes a week we're going to Europe. With regard to the near term, the best you can do, and the administration has done this, is call up, some Japanese and South Korean customers and say, hey, could you free up a cargo or so? Let it go to Europe. But everybody's going to be hoarding and concerned with their own supplies at this point. So there's only a very little you can do. No, Europe is not really prepared. They have emergency plans. They'll have to go to rationing if the Russians really turn off the gas. They have only bad wartime options to ration really what'll be a irreplaceable loss of supply in the next year or so. Could get better in years after that if we allow more investment, more liquefaction and regasification facilities, more projects. It'll get better in coming years, but this winter is going to be very difficult.
Okay, Bob, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It was very helpful. That's Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy Group. Coming up, it's time for an update on the midterm elections with our contributors, Jeannie Shan Zaino and Rick Davis. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Every week we check in on midterms 2022 with our political contributors, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shan Zaino of Iona College. So Ricky, I've just renamed you. I'm sorry about that. Give us a sense, this far into the primaries, what do we know that we didn't know at the beginning of it? Are there any trends that you're identifying we're seeing?
Well, we continue to look at which races Donald Trump can influence, right? I mean, he's got his own cast of hundreds and hundreds of endorsees, and we keep track of who's winning and who's losing. And right now, I'd say it's still a little bit of a jump ball. He's had a bunch of wins, but also some very high profile losses. So that's one aspect of it. Two is, are there any races that are going to particularly help Republicans in the Senate? And I'd say right now, that's the biggest question. Most pundits have the Senate as a jump ball, and that, of course, has enormous implications on the second half of Joe Biden's term. So those are the two things I'm keeping my eye on. I would say one other thing is there's some really interesting governor's races that, depending upon the primaries, are going to make those potential real problems for Republicans.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think the biggest surprise of the season, quite frankly, has been a year that started out very, very badly for Democrats, quite frankly. They had sort of lost all hope, has to a certain extent turned around. Rick just mentioned the Senate is now a toss-up. It is possible that Democrats could hold the Senate. The House still very much remains for the Republicans, but because of the Supreme Court decisions, because of January 6th, because of Donald Trump sort of reinserting himself into the national conversation, Democrats are feeling a little bit more hopeful than they otherwise would have been. And we saw this in a special election out in Nebraska where, and I know it sounds silly, David, so you're going to chuckle, but Democrats lost. They did lose the special election out there, but they did better than expected. And when I messaged this out, Rick Davis said to me, well, how is that a good sign? Well, you know, in a year like this, it's a hopeful sign. These candidates were pretty much generic candidates. It's a district that Donald Trump won by 11. Republicans held it by 5. So for Democrats, that's a hopeful sign at this point.
So, Rick, I don't want to chuckle at our friend Jeannie here, but at the same time, that was a test on pro-choice versus pro-life, right? I mean, that was number one on the agenda out in Nebraska, and the pro-choice person lost.
Lost by, as Jeannie said, 6 points. And I would have thought it would have been closer, frankly, because this is the one election we can look at that came on the heels of the Roe decision by the Supreme Court. And it's a suburban district. It's basically Lincoln, Nebraska North. And you would have thought in a special election, which tends to favor a low turnout, that the activists who were pro-choice activists would have come out in droves to register their protest against what the Supreme Court did by voting. And there's no evidence that that happened. And so the reality is it's not a good indication for Democrats coming up. It's not a seat that should actually be in play at all, other than the fact that the most former member of Congress, Fortenberry, wound up getting indicted and convicted of lying to the FBI. So that's never a good thing for your party in power in that district, but no signs yet that the Supreme Court's influencing these specials.
Jeannie wants rebuttal time.
I want rebuttal time, Rick Davis. I just want to remind everybody, inflation is over 8%. The president's approval ratings are under 40%. And in a district that Trump won by 11, Democrats held it to 5. And oh, by the way, the Republicans outspent the Democrat in that district 10-1 on the airwaves. So for all of that, she got within 6. That's a good sign for Democrats in 2022. I'm done, David.
No, that's excellent. But by the way, I think the Democrats have a new strategy now. It's sort of like the Doolittle raid when they went and dropped a few bombs on Tokyo. We have Gavin Newsom taking airtime over in Florida. This is a little bit of what an ad for Gavin Newsom from California ran in Florida.
It's Independence Day, so let's talk about what's going on in America. Freedom, it's under attack in your state. Your Republican leaders, they're banning books, making it harder to vote, restricting speech in classrooms, even criminalizing women and doctors. I urge all of you living in Florida to join the fight, or join us in California, where we still believe in freedom.
Well, so what is this, Rick? He's going to recruit people to move from Florida to California to vote for him? Is that the theory?
I think what he's really doing, David, is trying to grab the freedom agenda. And I think actually pretty effectively, it's a good ad. And to jump across the country and go after Florida is a message only one, and that is, I'm looking for you in the general election in 2024, Ron DeSantis. I'm going to be the freedom candidate. You can be the one that regulates books and regulates classrooms and regulates women. And I mean, like, he's setting up a really interesting narrative for 24, and he's doing it with a very inexpensive buy, but he's getting a ton of free media off of it.
Yeah, and you know, there was a poll out recently which showed Gavin Newsom is doing better against the Republicans and Trump in 24 than Kamala Harris. So it's still early. You know, it's my favorite topic, but I love this ad. And as the governor from New Jersey, Phil Murphy, said, he really is taking it to the Republicans in an area they don't want to talk about, which is all these social issues, women's rights, the rights of, you know, critical race theory, all of these things they don't want to talk about when, again, inflation is over 8%. 8%. They should be talking about the economy, but they're not. And so that's good for Democrats. And Gavin Newsom is sort of leading that charge across the country.
Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis are going to be staying with us because we're going to talk about a lively debate in Wyoming and the effect of the January 6th hearings potentially on Liz Cheney's future. That's still ahead with Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, and this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Our republic is not in danger because of President Donald J. Trump. President Trump was an excellent president for the United States of America and especially for the state of Wyoming.
We are now embracing a cult of personality, and I won't be part of that, and I will always stand for my oath and stand for the truth.
And there you saw it, a stark contrast as Liz Cheney tries to defend her position in the House of Representatives against several oncomers out in Wyoming, and she appears to be perhaps in some difficulty. Still with us are Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino of Iona College. So Rick, first of all, how much trouble is she in?
Yeah, well, she's in deep trouble. Polling right now has her significantly behind Harriet Hageman, who is one of her former friends and the one who Donald Trump has endorsed for this job. And so that's the real fight to focus on. And I would say some of the exchanges in that debate between Hageman and Cheney were really interesting, especially when Hageman said that the rioters on January 6th were just expressing their First Amendment rights, and Cheney pounced on it. Of course, a core issue of her chairing the January 6th committee, and said, no way, these are not the way people express themselves in a peaceful environment.
Well, it's pretty extraordinary, Jeannie, if we're really talking about an assault on the Capitol where lives were lost, incredible damage was done during the counting of the Electoral College votes, if we're going to call that a peaceful demonstration as a practical matter. But do you think that maybe the January 6th hearings may change some minds even in Wyoming?
You know, I don't know if it's going to change minds. Last Thursday night, David, I did something I've never done. I sat down and watched a Wyoming primary debate on the Republican side, and it was astonishing. You had 4 people on the stage denying everything that the January 6th committee has shown us in the last few weeks, Liz Cheney being the only exception to that. And some of what they were saying about this being peaceful, people just using their First Amendment rights, have been proven not to be true. And this is where we find ourselves. So to Rick's point, Liz Cheney very well may lose this battle, but I think in the end she will win the war. She was out at the Ronald Reagan Library the other day making a speech. I think she's thinking seriously about running in 24 or 28. You listen to some of those lines. There's a point in that speech where she spoke to girls and women across the country about how the men are not leading very well in this country. Makes me think she has designs on something bigger than Wyoming. Even if she does lose, I think she will make the case to the American people that this is an important issue that we cannot forget. And the losers in all of this is the Republican Party, because Donald Trump is likely to put himself out there as a 24 candidate earlier than expected because of what they've shown him to be potentially guilty of.
Rick, what about it? You've advised more than your fair share, run these campaigns for presidency. Does she have a shot at running for president? Is that, do you think, her long-term strategy? And if so, what should her next step be if she doesn't hold her seat?
Yeah, if she doesn't hold her seat, she's got to find a way to maintain her public persona, right? She's got the combination of running for re-election and chairing this January 6th committee that's literally keeping her in the headlines every single day. The last thing you want to do is, if you're no longer in Congress come November, disappearing from the political scene. Of course, that just happens to be when people start announcing for their intentions to run for president for 2024. And so that's certainly going to be one of the hot ticket items for her. If Donald Trump does not run, that's actually going to be a tougher argument for her, because she, of course, has become the anti-Trump. And if Trump is running, then she becomes a natural to get in there and mix it up with him. Could you imagine the debate with her and Trump together?
It's good television. So, Jeannie, what about it? Is actually Liz Cheney rooting for Donald Trump to get in the race?
I'm rooting for both of them to get in the race, David. You know, she may be politically, of course. I think the better part of her, you know, a small d Democrat, is hoping that he doesn't. But, you know, I look at Truth Social. He is getting very nervous about what the committee has found and his legal, you know, whether he's going to be guilty legally. I think he's going to announce pretty soon. And I think that she she may then decide she's going to run.
And you two will be here to cover it with us. Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona College. And this is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg.